You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Gina Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Belle Brett.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Belle Brett on the show with me. She has a fantastic new book called Gina and the Floating World, and it is out and available everywhere books are sold now. Welcome to the show, Belle.
Thank you, Hank. I'm really honored to be on this show.
I'm excited to have you today. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Okay, well, very interestingly, my first memories of that start with art. My mother was an artist, and as a very young child, I loved drawing. And I have very early memories, and I actually have evidence still because I'm a saver, of stories that I wrote kind of like early graphic novels. And they have multiple frames. And I remember saying the story out loud as I was drawing. And I have dozens of these. And I don't remember any of the stories much, although I think some of them had themes about poor little girls becoming rich. But at any rate, as I said, I didn't commit these to actual writing. So the stories are gone. I was a pretty imaginative child. And I do remember making up lots of games and that involved storytelling as well. But I didn't actually think about writing really until my 30s. I remember my favorite assignment in high school was writing a short story. And why that didn't prompt me to think that maybe this was something I would enjoy doing more of, I really can't tell you. I didn't have any options when I was in college to do any creative writing courses because they weren't offered at my college at the time. So I didn't follow that up. But in my 30s, I decided I was interested in becoming a travel writer. I loved traveling. I'd done a lot of it by then. And I took a class that involved a lot of different kind of essay writing, and I really enjoyed it. It was at the local adult ed center, coincidentally, where I met my husband not long after. He was my photography teacher, just as a little aside. But so I did some of that, and then I kind of left that aside. I had a pretty busy career, and I actually spent more time doing the art, taking a lot of classes. But then again, in my mid-40s, I was actually working on my doctoral dissertation. And I don't know if it was some kind of busman's holiday, as it were, but I decided to start writing a novel. And I think it was just the pressure of doing this very intense academic writing sort of sent me in that direction. I got quite involved in it and did that for a little while. Again, got caught up in career. And then just a little bit, a few years after that, a friend and I decided to write a screenplay together. We had been thinking about this idea of something that had happened to us. And so I worked on screenplay writing for a while. I did that one, and I actually wrote another one that became the basis for Gina and the Floating World a few years later. But I would say it was around, although I kind of toyed with novelizing that a little bit, it was really not till about 2006 that I got very into writing to the point where I was writing fiction. Not the screenplay writing anymore. I was definitely into the novel writing, took lots of classes, courses, took a very seminal program for me called Novel Incubator at a place called Grub Street Writers here in Boston, which is our big writing center. And I spent a lot of time with it. So it's fairly recent that I actually started to think of myself as a writer and really began to devote a lot of time to it.
You mentioned earlier that you were intrigued by the idea of travel writing. Did you get to do any traveling and writing about those experiences?
Alas, I think my travel writing has just been limited to the journals I kept while I travel, and I do try to write about my experiences, although I have to say my travel journals are not all that interesting as I look back, and they're really just compendiums of the things I've done and what I've eaten and so forth. So I don't think my great skill lay in that direction. So interestingly, I didn't do that despite the love of travel and the love of writing.
Do you feel like because you did spend some time in Asia, didn't you?
I did.
Do you feel like that those experiences have informed the work that you're doing now in writing fiction?
Well, certainly the trip to Asia was a kernel of the inspiration for Gina and the Floating World. That was what happened there was I actually spent almost a year traveling. I had just left my career in teaching. I hadn't been teaching all that long. I was teaching elementary school, and it wasn't a good fit for me. And I had been inspired by another friend of mine who had traveled across Asia the previous year. And I decided I was going to do this round the world circuit, but I actually spent most of my time in Asia. And what happened was I was going to go to Australia, and the airport that I was supposed to fly into, Darwin, had a typhoon, and it blew out the airport. So I changed my plans, and I found a cheap ticket that allowed me to go from Bangkok to Taiwan, Korea, 2 stops in Japan, Honolulu, and Los Angeles. So it was going to get me back home across the ocean. So I did end up in Japan for several months. And it was there that running out of money, I ended up taking a job as a bar hostess. And that, when you read the book, to my readers out there, that is the job that my protagonist ends up taking and where her adventures begin. So I was very intrigued by Japan in particular. I actually loved all my sojourn in Asia. It was a very interesting time. But Japanese culture I found particularly interesting. It's very complex, and there's just a lot of different interesting parts to it. So I was interested in exploring that more through this novel.
You said that you were involved in elementary education, but found that was not a good fit for you. What about it do you think that you didn't connect with, and how do you feel that your creative life now might have been informed by that experience, even though it was ultimately not for you in the long run?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the fit. What I loved about it. I actually had a career in education, broadly speaking, but the classroom working with very young children was, I think, not the good match for me. I think if I'd actually worked with older children, I would have found it a better match. But I wasn't good at classroom management, and I found that all this joy I had in the planning and thinking about how children learn and develop, which was really, I think, my inspiration for wanting to teach. It didn't mesh when I came to the day-to-day having to manage a room full of children. And I, unfortunately, with both my teaching experiences, one in London, where my family was actually living, where I'm actually British. I was born in England, though I moved here at a very tender age, age 2. But I had gone back to get some training there because they were doing some very interesting things in education. And I had a classroom of 30 the first year. And then when I moved back to the States, I worked in a public school, and I had a classroom of 40. And I did have some help, but for a very inexperienced teacher, that was overwhelming. And I had almost no support. So it just left a slightly bitter taste in my mouth. But back to your other part of your question, I think that interest in how people develop has been a real root of my academic interests as well as some of what I've done in my career. Not just the scholarly part, but my actual career. I was a career counselor for a number of years, and I was just always intrigued with how people become who they are, how they make decisions and make choices, and I think that's certainly reflected in this novel that I've just written. And it's I have on my website I have a little kind of a motto, a little few words that sum up the way I see my writing, and it's talking about exploring coming of age across the lifespan, and that's just an interest of mine. I think we come of age at all different times of life. We tend to think of it as the adolescent blooming into adulthood, but with different life challenges, we have to rework the way we think and do things, and I think we come of age all over again. And our needs change, and that causes us to have to rethink things. So I would say working with children certainly exposed me to a lot of issues in the early part of development that I continue to find interesting.
Speaking of coming of age stories, Gina in the Floating World is definitely a coming of age story, but it's not your typical coming of age story. What is it about these stories of finding ourselves and people really discovering their true self, their purpose, all of these things that are wrapped up in that? What is it about those kinds of stories that interest you?
Well, I think they speak very much to the experiences that each of us has in different ways as we grow up, and sometimes when we read, it's to see ourselves and see how we're similar to the characters, or maybe different in how their experiences are the same or different, and sometimes we really want a contrast. We want to learn about how people think about and see the world differently through different lenses than we might explore it. So I do think it's a topic, I know for me as a reader, it's a topic I certainly seek out and enjoy in my as I choose books. And I think other people like that too. And I know I haven't written anything finished that's young adult, but I know certainly a lot of the young adult literature really deals with that. And I'm sure young people really, again, like grappling with different persona as they read about those experiences that the protagonists in the books they read have.
Belle, what is the Floating World?
Okay, so the Floating World is quite literally the reference actually there's a couple references, and I actually have a blog entry on this. It was originally a Buddhist concept, and it was the idea of the illusory world we live in, the fleeting floating world, and it was a time almost a sorrowful look at the world, but as more modern Japan developed, which was more like in the 17th to 18th centuries, the idea morphed into the floating world was actually the old pleasure quarters of Tokyo, the old Edo, and it's where the courtesans and the kabuki theater and the geisha and the prostitutes really hung out. It was all about seeking pleasure. And so the floating world then became a real source of inspiration, particularly for Japanese artists and the woodblock artists, which I refer to quite a bit in my novel. It's something I've always loved. I grew up with some of those woodblocks in my house, and so I always loved those, and these lovingly portrayed portraits of these with elaborate costumes, etc., of these various people, the actors and the courtesans, etc. So the woodblock, that type of art is called ukiyo-e, with an E at the end. So it's kind of this floating world, but the art added onto it. And in my novel, the floating world figures very prominently because my protagonist, and this is not a spoiler because it's in the first line of the book, my protagonist becomes a prostitute. She slides into prostitution. And she does it through being really in some aspect of the modern floating world in Tokyo. But she also gets involved in the arts and learns a lot about the arts. So I also saw it as a metaphor for her state of mind, her confusion, and trying to figure out what she wanted to do. She's very much in her own floating world. So I thought it was made a good title for the book.
Yeah, absolutely. There are also a lot of parallels, maybe not parallels as much as nods toward Dorothy and Oz in this book. Was that something that was in your mind from the beginning, or as it unfolded, did you kind of realize that this would be an interesting contrast? Kind of where did those things come into the story?
Yes, no, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked me that, because it didn't start out that way. I didn't wasn't thinking about the Wizard of Oz when I started this, but somewhere around the third iteration, and this book has been through many, many, many drafts, but about the third iteration, I started to see the parallels, and that's when I changed my protagonist's name to Dorothy, and I saw that. There she was in this foreign land, having these. She was on a quest for a goal, and she has these various friends she makes in some of the different aspects of her life, and one of them seems to need more courage, and one of them seems to need to understand that they're smart, and the other one needs to find her heart. And I started to see the companions that, of course, Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz has with her. And so I began to more explicitly find ways to create those parallels. And, of course, there's a couple of witches, and not literally. They're just people that have a kind of both a positive and a negative witchy side. And there's the wizard. And you have to figure out, is he a sham or not? So I kind of had fun playing with that once I started, and of course I have to go back and revisit the book and think about it. And there's some silver shoes, and for people who've seen the movie, they think of them as the ruby shoes, but in fact, in the book, Dorothy's shoes are silver. And so the question is, too, did she have the power all along over her destiny? And so that comes up, too. So there were really just so many fun things that I had to play with that I was kind of not hard to resist. And I do enjoy those times when people have done those modern retellings of fairy tales, or even other stories that we might be familiar with. So you don't need to appreciate that I think to enjoy the book, but it's another layer, if you want to explore it.
One thing that's really interesting, the title of the book is Gina in the Floating World, yet Gina's name is actually Dorothy, and she gets renamed by this person in the book, which is an interesting play by this character, and it seems like such a simple thing, but when I was reading it, when you see what happens to Dorothy, Gina, this sort of changing of the name has this odd kind of control as you start seeing her character develop. What was the idea behind changing Dorothy's name to Gina?
Okay, well, this will actually interest you. So I mentioned that I was a bar hostess when I was in Tokyo all those many decades ago in my 20s. And when I went to interview for the job, the man who would become my boss in the bar said that I think my name was particularly hard to pronounce in Japanese, by the Japanese with all the L's in it. as Dorothy's name would be hard because of the R. And he actually suggested calling me Gina. So I kind of liked that name. And he named, it was after, as it says in the book, that's exactly how it happened. It was after the actress Gina Lollobrigida. And I liked the name, and it just sang to me as I was writing this book. And I think a part of the point you're making, of course, is when you have another name, you become an actor. And you act in that, and you can be a different person than maybe the person that you are. And I found that was very true for me. I came into that job at a time when I had just, in the United States, I had been very involved with what we refer to as the second wave of feminism. And where, women were really out thinking about and demanding more rights, particularly in the workplace and work equality. And so there I was going into this somewhat sexist environment of the bar culture and having to be a person that was kind of an anathema to me in terms of my life back home. But when I thought of it, and I think of one of Dorothy's colleagues, the one who actually helped get her the job, tells her, just pretend you're acting in a play. And I had to do that too. And you kind of get into the role, it allows you to be somebody is different and behave in ways that you wouldn't at home because you're just acting, you're play acting. And you're going to leave that job, at the end of the day, and you can be whoever you want again.
The story it goes through, and again, going back to this coming of age theme, through these stages where Dorothy is exploring a new world, and then going through these situations where it's really exotic and things are very enticing and exciting. And then things start kind of taking a darker turn. Is there anything about that situation that you are trying to get across to the reader? Is this a cautionary tale, or is this just the fictional account of this character?
Well, that's an interesting question, whether it's a cautionary tale or not. One of the images that I like to conjure up when I think about Dorothy's story, which is very decidedly not my own, I might add, because sometimes people who know I had this job as a bar hostess, then, they leap to the next conclusion, and I have to assure them that no, I did not take the step that my character takes to become a prostitute. Not at all. I'm not that character. I was somewhat a little bit older and somewhat wiser, much less naive than her. So one of the images that I like to conjure up, and I'm not even sure it's true, but it's one of those things we hear, that when the frog gets put in cold water and you turn the heat up,
right,
it doesn't know to leap out, but if you put it in boiling water, it leaps out. So I've been told that's not quite true, that the frog, even put in cold water, heating up, will eventually figure out what's going on, which, of course, you hope that my character will.
Yeah, it makes for a great story, though.
That's right. That's right. So I think this idea that when when you gradually, and as she does, sort of gradually slip into a situation that initially doesn't feel dangerous, you might not see the danger as it's just coming in small increments at you. So that was kind of one way of thinking about it. And is that a cautionary tale? I don't know. I think, I'm not sure. I think I'll let the readers decide whether they want to think of it that way, because there's nothing wrong with thinking about it that way. My character obviously learns a lot about herself in the course of having these very negative experiences. And so, right. Is that a bad thing? I think by not exposing ourselves sometimes to risk-taking situations, we miss out. Now, whether one wants to throw caution to the wind and quite the way that my character ends up doing, partially because I think she's confused about the culture she's in. She's confused about what's right within that culture. And she also, she thinks that what she's doing is normal, and she doesn't realize that it's maybe not. And so that's, I think, something about her and her, her own naivete and trusting nature.
Well, and one of the great things about fiction, and I think hindsight in real life gives us these benefits as well, is the ability to look at a situation and watch someone go through it and glean some truth about our own life from it. Whether it's a cautionary tale or not, who knows? But we can see Dorothy going through these situations, and then we have the benefit of watching how it changes her, how it matures her, how it builds her character in some ways. And then you get to have that great existential discussion about the experiences we have and how they mold us and shape us into the people that we are. And hopefully we can, through fiction, we get to have some of those life-altering experiences as well without having to go through the pain.
Yes. Yes, I think that's one of the great delights of reading, isn't it?
Yes.
It's being for a moment in these other worlds and in other people's heads, and feeling some of the anxiety and some of the feelings without actually having to go through it yourself.
Exactly. Belle, the new book, Gina in the Floating World, is available everywhere now. We've got a link to it in the show notes. What are you working on now that the book is out and this, you have put this into the world? What are you working on next?
Well, it's been, the last some months have been an interesting journey. I really not sure I had anticipated just how much work it would be to get a book out in the world, both in terms of just preparing it and even after it's been written and edited, and then doing the marketing. So I have to confess, I haven't been doing a great deal of fiction writing in the last some months because of that. I'll make one little aside that's related to this. I had mentioned early on that I originally was a young artist, and my mother was an artist, and I've returned to visual art as well in the last few years, interestingly, almost simultaneously with my writing, although maybe a little later. And for me, it's very much a complementary activity. And one of the things I have been working on and continue to work on is an exhibit that is primarily of collage. I like to work in paper collage, although I do some watercolor as well, that represents some different themes and visual aspects of the novel. So they're collages that are inspired by the novel. And I probably have about a dozen of these now, and I've actually been showing them and getting them into juried shows locally, which has been exciting, rewarding for me at the same time that this book is coming out. And I'm trying to put together a show and that I can have somewhere, and then maybe do a reading with it as well, in addition to the more just the traditional kinds of events that I'm going to do. So that's something I'm actually looking forward to getting back more into, because I've also had to put that aside a bit for these last few months. But in terms of my other writing, I actually have another completed novel, which is very different from this one. I know, we're encouraged often as writers, you write a certain kind of book and then people want to see more of that kind of book. And for me, the interest is in writing different kinds of things. And this book that I've written is for two women in their 40s. It's about a novel of friendship, and it's very funny, a lot of it. There's some dark moments, but there's more hilarious moments than there are dark moments. So that may be one that I will try to get out into the world in the future. I have this goal, and I will see how it take shape, because I'm not that young anymore, of writing about each decade of life to kind of fulfill that goal of what it looks like to come of age across the lifespan. I think some of this will be take the form of short stories, maybe a novella. I actually would like to write in the male point of view, so I have an idea about a man in his 50s that I'd like to write about. So anyway, I think that'll be a lot of fun. I like having goals like that, and I think I would enjoy exploring the lifespan in different ways.
That sounds fantastic to me, Belle. I can't wait to see what you come up with. If people are just meeting you on the podcast and want to see more of your work and follow along with your blog, and I think at your blog you even have some of your visual art there as well.
I do.
Where can they find you?
Okay, my website is www.bellebrett.com, and that's BELLEBRETT, all one word. And there's links on that, particularly in my bio, there's links to my art website. There's links to another website that I do that's completely different on downsizing, which is something that my husband and I are both trying to do, and it's called Slow Downsizing. And there's links to other blog posts I've written there as well as the blog on that particular website is very much to do with a novel. So I have a lot of things that have to do with the topics that the novel covers, and as well as my writing process. And I do some other things there too, like review books that I've read.
Fantastic. Belle, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. We're going to send everyone to pick up a copy of Gina and the Floating World. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me, Hank. This was really fun. I enjoyed it a lot.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Jason and Joey took their food trays outside and sat high above the parking lot on the secluded stairwell that had become their lunchtime hangout, picking at their Thanksgiving specials and swapping updates. They were almost finished eating before Jason managed to screw up the courage to say what he needed to. "I want to apologize." Joey looked puzzled. "What the hell for?" "Because your coma was my fault." "Yours? The horseman beamed me. You didn't." "Hey, want to see something cool? Look what I found on my phone." Joey produced the device, hit a few buttons, and swiped his finger. An orange circle hung in a field of black, overexposed, something that had been moving fast when the flash caught it. "I was trying to get his picture, right? Like an idiot? Well, I didn't get him, but that is the pumpkin he threw at me." Jason stared at the blurry orange shape for a long time. "Cool." "Cool? Can you imagine if we actually got a picture of the headless horseman? We'd be famous by now." He pocketed the phone. "Hey, do you want the rest of this turkey? It looks like bologna." "Tastes like bologna, too." He speared the slice anyway. "Look, this is going to sound weird, but I think I made you a target." "What do you mean?" "I made you a target by telling you about my gift. It's some sort of magical rule. If we reveal ourselves to a normal person, whoever we tell becomes a target for ghosts. And usually, they die." "And you told me anyway?" "No, I'd already told you. There was no way to untell you. Don't be mad. It all worked out, right? Right?" Joey's expression had darkened. "Give me a second here. And there's a bright side." "What bright side?" "Now you'll have a gift too." "Me?" "That's what your coma was. Some kind of transition. You got targeted, but you survived. You'll be a founder now, like Ichabod. You'll pass your gift to your kids like he passed his to me." Joey looked worried. "What kind of gift will I get?" "People get gifts that complement their natural abilities. It could be anything." "Anything? So, I could read minds?" "I guess." "Turn purple and levitate?" "Probably not. Something that expresses the essential you." Then I'll have an actor's gift. What's an actor's gift? Jason shrugged. Super narcissism? Shut up. So you're not mad? Joey was shaking with excitement. Mad? This is the coolest thing ever! We'll be like the dynamic duo, fighting supernatural foes up and down the eastern seaboard. Jason laughed, feeling epic relief. I thought you'd be pissed. Nah. What's a little coma between friends? He took a bite out of a Nutter Butter, grinning madly. I'm going to be a superhero. But you can't tell anyone. Why not? Weren't you listening? Everyone we tell dies. You can't talk about your gift to anybody. But if they were targeted and lived, we could have our own X-Men. Yeah, or all your friends could die. Do you want to risk that? No, I guess not. But I don't do closets very well, you know? I came out at conception. Promise to keep it to yourself. Yeah. Joey shifted sideways and walked his sneakers up the brick. So, the essential me. Ooh, I know what gift I'll get. I'll get a singer's gift. What's a singer's gift? Jason shrugged. Superhuman drug tolerance? Shut up!